Welcome back to Unfair Housing. Thanks for joining us this week as we continue our discussion on urban renewal and the development of the nation's highway system. This week, we'll take a look at the role of highway construction in segregation. As a reminder, we have several episodes available that cover the history of building suburbia under the New Deal, which help lay the foundation for today's discussion. Also, last week we discussed urban renewal policies and projects at the federal, state, and local level that destroyed Black communities. If you missed any of our previous conversations on these topics, I recommend you check them out. As a reminder, this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion on housing segregation, but rather provide you with highlights of policies and practices that led to housing segregation. And as always, we welcome lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that you exercise kindness and consideration when making and responding to comments. Okay, so let's get into it. In last week's episode, we discussed how the government took personal property for public use, often in low-income and/or minority neighborhoods. Another way the federal and local governments took property to address slum clearance was through the construction of highways. The need for highways became particularly apparent as white America left urban areas for the suburbs. A road system was needed to connect suburbia to urban cores to allow white travelers quicker routes to get to their jobs and to shopping, and to address congestion in city centers. Further, Americans were gravitating away from public transit and railroad travel for the ease of travel and privacy afforded by using personal automobiles. You may recall from last episode, we discussed Thomas McDonald, who worked with FDR to prepare a report to begin discussions on a national highway system. McDonald later worked on a second report for FDR, which mapped out a plan that strikingly resembles today's national highway system. The plan had highways travel through city centers, with larger cities encircled by beltways. McDonald championed use of inner-city expressways to eliminate low-income housing and unsightly areas within cities. It took another decade or so before the construction of the National Interstate Highway System began, with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which was the largest public works program the country had seen to this point. The program was funded by the federal government, but it was state highway departments and local governments that determined the exact location of highway routes in and around urban areas. Thus, they decided which land would be taken for public use and which communities would be destroyed as a result. Public officials and policymakers knowingly utilized the construction of interstate highway systems to destroy low-income, often Black, neighborhoods. In the span of 2 decades, at least 475,000 families lost their homes to these highway projects. Combating blight with highways was a primary motivator for Robert Moses in New York, who you may recall we briefly discussed last week. In 1933, Moses was appointed the Parks Commissioner of New York City by then-Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, where he helped build many parks and roadways. In time, Moses had significant involvement in constructing highways through the city, including the Cross Bronx and Brooklyn-Queens expressways. Moses believed the government should be able to control the use of private citizens' property and was a profound supporter of slum clearance, stating the slums needed to be completely eradicated. So while Moses was in charge of city planning, he decided the highway should run directly through these communities. Moses recognized the intentional harm that would come to minority families as a result of his plans, but had no interest in letting their complaints or the harm that would come to them dictate highway development. Part of Moses's plan to construct the highway system through urban areas included having property along the route declared a slum by state assessors. This would cause the value of the land to be significantly diminished, which would then allow the government to acquire the condemned land through eminent domain for much less than its value had it not been declared a slum. Thus, any compensation for the taking was arguably not just as seemingly required by the Fifth Amendment. Further, as mentioned last week, renters had no recourse if they were evicted from their homes due to eminent domain used for highway construction. Surprisingly, Moses appeared to support some form of assistance to those displaced. He addressed the House Committee on Public Works on the matter in 1955, promoting inclusion of relocation payments to tenants who had been displaced as part of the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act. While initially successful at getting buy-in from the House and support from his New York congressmen, many, including President Eisenhower, rejected the idea due to the considerable cost it would bring to the highway project. Unfortunately, the provision was removed by the Senate, and ultimately the act was agreed to without compensation for those displaced included. Harlan Bartholomew was another figure who had great influence on using eminent domain to destroy Black neighborhoods to make way for parks and highways. Bartholomew was the first full-time city planner in the United States. Once he established his own firm, Bartholomew helped create city plans for over 30 cities across the U.S. between the 1920s and 1950s, placing heavy emphasis on automobile travel and highways. Bartholomew began his career developing plans for Newark, New Jersey, where he was ultimately hired by the city to create its first master development plan. After establishing a reputation in planning, he was hired by the city of St. Louis to be the city planner. While the economic growth and stability of cities was at the forefront of Bartholomew's planning, race played a significant role. He wanted to prevent Black Americans from moving into white neighborhoods, believing their presence would decrease the value of the finer residential districts. His slum clearance plans resulted in more than 70,000 Black residents being removed from St. Louis's neighborhoods, and many Black businesses and churches were destroyed as well. In the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood alone, more than 18,000 Black residents were displaced, 5,600 housing units were lost, and 800 businesses and 40 churches were destroyed. A once successful neighborhood spanning 54 blocks no longer existed. Only a quarter of those forced to leave their St. Louis neighborhoods were compensated, and those who were unable to afford to purchase new housing often relocated to existing segregated public housing. Bartholomew's impact on the city of St. Louis was profound. City planners continued his slum removal visions until the 1970s, the effects of which are still felt today as the downtown area of St. Louis is split by giant concrete expressways and roadways, making the city difficult to navigate by walking or biking, and the city is still highly segregated. The displacement of families within the neighborhoods taken by highway construction led to many of those families relocating to remaining poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods in transition from white to Black. So due to many of the issues we've discussed this season, using highways to clear areas of blight mostly just shifted blight to new areas. But it wasn't just the government that supported using highways to clear blight. There was significant support from private industry, particularly groups involved in highway construction, to use highways to get rid of slums. The Urban Land Institute, a group of urban developers and real estate professionals, were insistent expressways should run through city cores to get rid of slums and save business districts. The American Road Builders Association and the American Concrete Institute had similar viewpoints, voicing support for using highways to eliminate blight. Automobile lobbyists were part of the conversation as well, touting how highways stimulated increases in land value and sped up reclaiming the slums for better public uses. Generally, those in opposition were the ones with quieter voices and less financial backing to make their voices heard. Many cities across the country felt the impacts of the tactics used by Moses and Bartholomew and the influence lobbyists had on using highways to clear blight. Chris, tell us about the impacts highway construction projects had in Detroit, Michigan, and Los Angeles, California.
Detroit, Michigan was an area significantly impacted by many of the discussions we've had this season, including urban renewal and highway construction as a means to eliminate the slums and reduce Black wealth. The Hastings Street thoroughfare, just east of downtown Detroit, was made up of two Black neighborhoods, Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, which was named after the rich soil in the area. It was a tight-knit, well-rounded community made up of over 130,000 residents and more than 300 Black-owned businesses. Paradise Valley in particular was a vibrant business district full of culture in the 1920s to 1940s. Top musicians came from across the country to perform there, including Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, and Miles Davis. The very first recordings of Aretha Franklin singing were done there, along with numerous recordings of her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin of New Bethel AME Church. Of course, the area was also prone to the issues we've discussed so far, created in part by redlining and restrictive covenants, which kept Black Americans from settling in other parts of Detroit. Some sections of the neighborhood were overcrowded and some lacked proper sanitation. Additionally, Black Bottom was near the site of a race riot in 1943. As you may recall from episode 3, we discussed Detroit was prone to violence against Black Americans migrating to the area and seeking housing during wartime development projects. The riot broke out when a mixed-race housing development was built just outside the Black Bottom neighborhood. White mobs attacked the area, and a period of unrest went on for 7 months. At the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, the housing was turned into housing for Black families only, but unfortunately the violence against Black families continued. While the disturbances occurred just outside Black Bottom, the area was considered a threat to Detroit. The mayor decided the neighborhoods should be condemned and all private businesses be disposed of to make way for redevelopment. By the mid-1940s, the mayor and city council approved a redevelopment plan that included the demolition of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley to make way for the development of I-375, which ran right through the neighborhood and eventually eliminated the Hastings Street thoroughfare, forcing many businesses to close or relocate and eliminating the rich culture and history of the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods. Today the area is home to Ford Field of the Detroit Lions, Lafayette Park, and several high-rise buildings. But the taking didn't stop there. In an attempt to reduce the black population, the city of Detroit created a master plan in 1959 that led to the use of federal urban renewal dollars to demolish black neighborhoods, to expand a Chrysler automobile manufacturing plant, and to build I-75 Chrysler Expressway, which was the route used to get to the Chrysler manufacturing plant, a move the federal government knew would disproportionately displace black families. The highway project alone displaced over 4,000 families, nearly 90% of whom were black, and who did not receive compensation. 12 years later, the city was ordered to build back housing for those who were displaced, but as you can imagine, after so long, very few were ever found and few received any assistance. As Alicia mentioned, government takings of property to make way for highways occurred all over the country, including in California. Sugar Hill was a neighborhood in Los Angeles which was demolished during an expansion of I-10. The demolition of Sugar Hill in the 1960s led to the destruction of dozens of homes, as well as the erasure of Berkeley Square, an affluent gated community. What sits on the former side of Berkeley Square is an off-ramp from I-10. Prior to its destruction, Sugar Hill was the wealthiest black neighborhood in Los Angeles, home to residents that worked to lift racially restrictive covenants. Unlike some of the neighborhoods we've mentioned so far, there were no signs of blight or violent activity to support an argument Sugar Hill was an area of disrepair. It was, however, a neighborhood of controversy. In the 1940s, before the neighborhood was known as Sugar Hill, it was known as West Adams, a neighborhood black people were barred from living in due to restrictive covenants, which required homes to be sold only to white residents. Despite these covenants, some upper-class black residents managed to move into West Adams as the white population left for Beverly Hills. Shortly thereafter, West Adams became known as Sugar Hill, named after a prominent neighborhood in Harlem, New York. In 1945, the remaining white residents in Sugar Hill attempted to enforce the restrictive covenants, seeking to oust the wealthy black upper-class families who had moved in. This was before the famous Supreme Court holding in Shelley v. Kramer that prohibited the enforcement of racially restrictive covenants. In the Sugar Hill case, the NAACP and a resident named Hattie McDaniel, an actress and singer best known for her role in Gone with the Wind, fought back. The court sided with McDaniel and allowed the black residents to remain in Sugar Hill. 15 years after this momentous victory, the California Department of Transportation seized the neighborhood, almost in its entirety, through eminent domain. Following the seizure, Sugar Hill was destroyed to make way for I-10, which ran right through the center of the neighborhood. Much like other neighborhoods in Los Angeles, as well as around the United States, plans for highways to run through white neighborhoods were dismissed, while plans that placed highways on a path of destruction through neighborhoods of color were pushed forward. In Sugar Hill, the highway could have been routed differently, but the alternative was dismissed because it would have destroyed the fraternity and sorority row at the University of Southern California, a private university where even today, only 6.1% of its student population is black. We'll take a quick break, and when we return, we'll look at some local stories that demonstrate the use of highway construction to reinforce housing segregation. Stay tuned.
Hey folks, Alec here. We hope you're enjoying the Unfair Housing podcast so far. Thank you for joining us, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you'd like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. That's 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for other legal assistance, contact the CLS helpline at 800-405-1417. That's 800-405-1417. Don't forget to give us a like and follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also, be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X.
Welcome back. Many other areas of the country felt the impacts of highway construction furthering housing segregation. Here in Florida, we have our own horrendous history of enforcing suburban segregation using highway planning and construction. Morgan, share with us some specific examples throughout Florida.
Let's begin by looking at how highway construction impacted Central Florida. Segregation began in earnest in Orlando in the 1920s. A zoning commission was formed in 1923 to unofficially designate separate areas for Black residents. Remember, 1917 is when government zoning based on race was outlawed. In 1927, Orlando adopted a zoning code identifying most of the areas designated for Black residents as industrial, despite the presence of residential homes. The neighborhood of Paramore is one such area, and later served as the location for Griffin Park and Carver Court Black public housing projects. The neighborhood of Paramore in Orlando, Florida, is one of the oldest and largest Black neighborhoods in the city. It was formed at the heart of the Black segregated section of Orlando in the late 1800s. Paramore, though considered a single neighborhood, is really 3 Black neighborhoods, including Lake Dot, Callahan, and Holden. While the lineage of Paramore residents was and still is diverse, including residents from Africa and the Caribbean, as well as U.S.-born Black Americans and descendants of Seminole Indians, in 1927, the neighborhood was solely defined by its race, Black. As we discussed in episode 3, Paramore was a bustling middle-class neighborhood, but struggled following the development of 2 major highway systems, State Road 408 and Interstate 4, locally known as I-4. I-4 was constructed in 1964 and State Road 408 in 1973. I-4 largely follows the path of the South Florida Railroad, built in 1884. The railroad ran from Sanford, Florida to Tampa, Florida, and originally cut Orlando into 2 communities. Properties on the east were reserved for white families, and properties on the west were reserved for Black families. Post-World War II growth in military, technology, and tourism industries resulted in a population boom throughout Florida, but especially in Central Florida cities like Orlando. This growth, along with white flight to the suburbs, demanded a change in the residents' way of life and way of travel. As a result, I-4 began development in the 1950s and continued through the 1980s, though frequent travelers of I-4 would argue this construction never ends. To ensure the highway would be built, developers sought the backing of influential Orlando business people and residents. This included printing pro-highway editorials in Central Florida's newspapers advocating for the importance of I-4. Despite this campaign, residents expressed concerns by writing to the papers about the highway's impact to downtown businesses and impoverished communities. Highway builders responded, insisting the route could not go around the center of Orlando because then only 10% of drivers would benefit. Instead, the routes needed to go through the city, which of course would only reinforce the division of Orlando. While the expansion of the highway system was being debated, Paramore stood at the center of the planned highway. Though Orlando city officials had been systematically forcing Black residents west, the boundaries changed in 1962 when I-4 cut through Paramore. As part of the highway development, the construction took a section of the Griffin Park public housing project, as well as the eastern ends of most of the neighborhood of Paramore. The raised east-west expressway, known as State Road 408, permanently closed some streets, isolating Paramore and creating a new boundary to segregate the community. Griffin Park became surrounded by I-4 in the 408 highway system and sat at the center of highway access ramps, encircled by pollution. Residents over time, predominantly Black and low income, suffered from medical conditions like asthma, severe allergies, and increased mortality rates. Moving south in Florida, we'll take a look next at Overtown, a predominantly Black neighborhood in Miami, Florida, and the construction of Interstate 95. Overtown was once known as the colored town in Miami. It became the Harlem of the South because it was frequented by stars such as Ella Fitzgerald, Josephine Baker, and Billie Holiday. However, much like the story we heard of the Paramore neighborhood in Orlando, the construction of Interstate 95, or I-95, destroyed this prosperous, historic Black neighborhood. Miami was incorporated in 1896, and it was subject to Jim Crow laws like many cities in the South. Separate but equal laws at this time required the designation of colored sections of town. Enter Overtown. It was settled by Black workers building the Florida East Coast Railway through Miami. The railway served as the dividing line between Miami and Overtown. The neighborhood prospered with growing Black businesses and social life through the 1950s. However, this would change in the 1960s as highway construction developed to connect metropolitan cities throughout the state of Florida. As a result, much of Overtown was razed to make way for the construction of I-95, a 10-lane highway that cut through the center of Overtown. The original path of I-95 was set to follow the existing railway, so the highway would not have had to run through the center of Overtown. However, state transportation planners believed constructing I-95 through Overtown would allow the central business district of Miami to expand further west in the future. As I-95 extended its southernmost leg through Miami, the construction resulted in the displacement of over 8,500 Black households from Overtown and ripped through its business district, destroying 20 blocks of Black Miami. Overtown was one of the only places Black Americans could live in Miami, which meant the remaining area of Overtown became overcrowded. This overcrowding, coupled with repair issues due to lack of funding in Black neighborhoods generally, made Overtown the exact type of blight continued highway construction sought to remove, resulting in further development of expressways and a metro rail system destroying the area. The story of Overtown is one of clear discrimination. Unfortunately, the people of Overtown were unable to organize a response to avoid the destruction from I-95. The sort of propaganda that came with urban renewal programs made many believe I-95 construction was the best way to clear the slums of Overtown. This belief fails to take into account the fact that this highway construction is really what created the decline in an otherwise prosperous community. We've heard how highways have been used to create dividing lines and segregate communities, but there are other ways highways were used to negatively impact Black neighborhoods. The city of St. Augustine, Florida, is known for its rich history and is commonly called the nation's oldest city. Each year, over 2 million visitors come to St. Augustine, which makes for a booming tourist economy. However, not all communities in St. Augustine reap the benefits of this tourism as a result of how the interstate highway was constructed through this area. In the 1960s, lawmakers decided which exits would be made off I-95 to access the tourism area of St. Augustine. Although West Augustine, a predominantly Black neighborhood, had a direct route into the tourism area via King Street, lawmakers chose to have I-95 exits for St. Augustine at State Road 207 and State Road 16 instead. This meant tourism traffic was guided around West Augustine, creating a longer route into the city of St. Augustine. As a result, tourists do not travel through West Augustine, which remains a predominantly Black neighborhood, preventing tourist revenue and economic development from reaching the area, including access to city or county water and sewer. Such disinvestment has only worsened the neighborhood's attractiveness to new businesses and tourism traffic.
There's so much more we could share about how highways decimated Black neighborhoods. So many other areas of the country engaged in this tactic, including Nashville, Tennessee, which deliberately constructed I-40 to destroy the North Nashville Black community, or Syracuse, New York, which built Interstate 81 to destroy a Black community that was considered too close to Syracuse University, or Atlanta, which constructed I-20 to separate Black neighborhoods from white. But you can clearly see urban renewal projects and highway construction had devastating impacts on hundreds of thousands of people, many of them minorities, and certainly disproportionately so. What was pitched as improving city life took from the poor and drastically altered their lives. At a time when many Black Southerners were migrating north and west during the Great Migration, they were faced with segregation policies forcing most to live in overcrowded neighborhoods and ill-equipped housing. Properties that were in disrepair due to lack of access to quality mortgage products, decreased or cut funding from the government, insistence on segregation by race, along with a host of other factors, unsurprisingly, or what should have been unsurprisingly, created blight. Rather than address this disinvestment by improving the circumstances for the people experiencing those conditions, the issue was bulldozed over, literally. Instead, investment was made both by the government and private industry that created new urban areas that were off limits to or out of reach for Black Americans and the working poor who used to live there. And rather than eliminating slums and ghettos altogether, they simply created new areas of blight just in different neighborhoods. Some would even argue these programs didn't help cities as much as they were touted to do. Highways used to demolish blighted neighborhoods and divide white residents from black created vast concrete barricades for citygoers traveling by foot or bicycle. Public transit was not often planned along with highway development, leaving many cities unable to construct practical public transit systems to account for the needs of travelers not reliant on automobile transportation. Of course, some degree of urban development was needed and continues to be. And of course, we needed a national highway system with interregional connections and routes through and around cities. But it's clear these plans were not developed and executed with people in mind. Most of all, people of color. Thanks for joining us this week. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, give us a like and don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. We encourage you to leave us a comment and share our information with your friends and family. Please also subscribe to the podcast so you always know when new episodes are released. We look forward to having you back next week as we wrap up our first season. See you then.